Hello and welcome to everyone out there on YouTube who has joined us for this Sagan Medal prize-winning talk. I am Dr. Jennifer Hanley. I'm a planetary scientist at Lowell Observatory. And I'm this year's Science Organizing Committee Chair for the annual Division for Planetary Sciences meeting. So the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences Carl Sagan Medal recognizes and honors outstanding communication by an active planetary scientist to the general public. It is to be awarded to scientists whose efforts have significantly contributed to a public understanding of and enthusiasm for planetary science. Dr. Nicolle Zellner has spoken to thousands of people around the country and has reached millions more through her written articles, television appearances, radio interviews, and more. She regularly offers public observing nights at Albion College and encourages college and community members to look up, especially during worldwide events such as the annual International Observe the Moon Night, the 2012 Venus Transit, and the 2017 Great American Solar Eclipse. Dr. Zellner co-founded the Public Observing Program at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and is a member of one of the first classes of NASA's Solar System Ambassadors. The DPS recognizes Dr. Nicolle Zellner for her effective and wide-ranging outreach activities with this year's Sagan Medal. So we are fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Nicolle Zellner. She is giving this talk at Albion College in a live room, which is exciting. And so I'm going to let her take it away and talk about the First Lady Astronaut Trainees.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that lovely introduction. Before I get started, I want to thank the DPS Selection Committee for recognizing me with the Carl Sagan Medal. It's an honor to receive this award. I met him shortly before he passed away and told him that he was one of the reasons I stayed in science. So it's kind of nice to come a little bit full circle and receive this medal in his name. I also thank my family and my friends, my students, my advisors, my professors over the years who have helped nurture my love for science and have supported my outreach activities. I also thank everyone, and it's probably a really long list, who took the time to attend one of my presentations or one of my observing events or read one of my articles. I'm grateful that you attended or you paid attention to my article and that we were able to share a love of science together. So thank you so much for everybody who has supported me in my efforts. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the First Lady Astronaut Trainees. This group of high-flying women was recruited by a NASA doctor to see if they had the right stuff to fly in space. Sadly, none of them, well, almost none of them actually did fly in space. But their dream and their dare and the risks that they took to help realize their dream or help try to realize the dream continues to influence generations of women and scientists and girls. So getting to the moon is not an easy task, right? It's over 239,000 miles away. And we were working to develop the rocketry, understand the space fuel requirements, the fuel requirements, and figuring out the trajectories to get us to the moon. It took tens of thousands of people around the country working on this endeavor. And we also had to recruit and retain the people who could actually do the work to help us get there. A lot of these stories are at least partially documented in books like The Rocket Girls, Hidden Figures, We Could Not Fail, and variations of the Mercury 13. If you're interested in any of these stories or wanting to learn about these stories a little bit more deeply, I really encourage you to read one or all of these books. When the decision was made to go to the moon, we got there fairly quickly. There was a motivation to explore space on the part of the United States once the Sputnik Satellite started orbiting Earth. This was in 1957. By 1958, we had started getting some nice high-resolution images of the lunar surface from the Yerkes Observatory in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And we also had the formation of NASA, the civilian space agency that would help foster space exploration. By 1959, the Mercury 7 astronauts had been selected. These were 7 pilots who were interested in NASA's program and flying in space. And the things that we learned from the Mercury 7 would help lead the way for the Apollo astronauts a decade later to land on the moon and return safely to Earth. Whether or not we were first on the moon didn't really bother the administration at the time. Just getting there was an essential objective. In order to capitalize on the popularity of the space program and also the popularity of the Mercury 7 astronauts, Look magazine approached NASA to see if they would be interested in testing any women, and they put forth Betty Skelton. Betty Skelton was a woman who held multiple aviation and automotive racing records, and she was interested in seeing, what it was like to get tested under the same conditions that the Mercury 7 were being tested under. She impressed both the Mercury 7 and the NASA doctors with her personality and her charm, and they dubbed her 7.5, which I think is kind of a nice little nickname for her. Unfortunately, the tests didn't really go anywhere. Still, she provided an initial data point for the idea that women could withstand the stress of space exploration. Another woman who was tested very early on in the space program was Ruth Nichols. She was also a record-holding aviator. She was friends with Amelia Earhart, and along with a few other women, founded the 99s, the premier flying organization for female pilots. She was approached by Donald Flickinger, who was a general in the Air Force, to see if she was interested in undergoing any of the tests that had been devised for the Mercury astronauts. She was brought to the Wright base in Dayton, Ohio, underwent some of these tests, and while they were mixed results, she was still, her data showed that women could withstand the stresses and pressures of spaceflight. So Lovelace, Donald Flickinger approached then William Randall Lovelace, who was the NASA doctor that had tested the Mercury 7 astronauts. They had been to a space medicine conference and had learned that the Soviets were considering flying women cosmonauts to follow in the footsteps of Yuri Gagarin and the other Soviet space flyers. And they thought perhaps the United States should start a women in space program as well. They, after all, why not test women, right? We're smaller, lighter, they eat less, they breathe less, they need less oxygen, they need less water. Why not fly them into space? With the 2 data points, they approached NASA, the 2 data points from Ruth Nichols and Betty Skelton. They approached NASA for to see if NASA was interested in testing women, but NASA declined. Undeterred, they started their own program in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and now all they needed was the women. This is where Jackie Cochran comes into the story. Jackie was a longtime friend of Lovelace. Jackie and Lovelace became friends when she found out that Lovelace was devising and creating masks to help pilots breathe more efficiently and effectively at the high altitude in space. Jackie was very competitive. She also held multiple aviation records. She wanted to go farther, faster, and higher than any man. And if Lovelace's mask could help her do that, she was in. So when Lovelace approached her to help recruit women for the Women in Space program, she immediately accepted, and importantly, helped fund the program with $18,000, which is roughly the equivalent of $352,000 today. Hundreds of Jackie spread the word, and hundreds of applications were received at the Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque. Lovelace and Jackie and others on the staff went through all of those applications and identified 25 women who had 1,000 or more flight hours in a plane and were within the appropriate age range. They invited all 25 women to come to the clinic in Albuquerque. Some had to decline because they couldn't lose their jobs. Others quit their jobs in order to undergo these tests and have the chance to fly in space. After the initial round of testing, 13 women qualified. They included twins, single women, mothers, and world record holders in all sorts of aviation records. I'm not going to talk about all 13 of them today. After all, this isn't a class and there won't be a test, but I am going to talk to you a little bit about a few of them who have stuck in my mind through the years that I've been reading about these women and reading about the program. The first recruit is Jerry Cobb. Jerry Cobb was identified very early on by Flickinger and Lovelace as being, and I quote, a fine specimen. She had achieved multiple records already in aviation by the time she was in her 20s. And so Lovelace and Flickinger were very interested in testing her under the same conditions as the Mercury 7 astronauts and other people who had applied for the astronaut program. After the initial rounds of testing, Lovelace proclaimed that we, meaning the Lovelace Clinic, are in a position to say that certain qualities of the female space pilot are preferable to those of the male colleague. So her initial tests, her initial data points provided a lot of inspiration and a lot of optimism that the other women's results would be just as good. Her testing was quickly picked up by the press, and in the literature or the press of the time, the newspapers and other magazines of the time, she was called an astronatrix, a feminaut, an astronet, and other sorts of feminized words of astronauts. So it's good that we don't have that distinction anymore. Long before Mike and Scott Kelly, the NASA twin astronauts who were part of the recent NASA experiment on the International Space Station, came Jan and Marion Dietrich. These women grew up in Northern California and were teenage pilots attending the University of California at Berkeley. They graduated with degrees in mathematics and psychology. And immediately after college, Jan went off to work for an aircraft company, flying corporate executives to and from their various appointments. In her early 30s, by the time she applied to the program, she had over 8,000 hours in an airplane, which was an extraordinary number of flight hours. Her sister Marion went on to work for the local newspapers, accumulating about 1,500 hours at the time of her application. So while maybe Marion's numbers weren't as high as Jan's, the fact that they were twins, I think, was really appealing to the doctors. I'll make a note that they were 5'3" and weighed 100 pounds and kind of nailed the astronaut tests. I'll just tell you that. Janora Jessen is another of the original Mercury First Lady Astronaut Trainees. It's hard not to call them the Mercury 13 because that phrase has become so ingrained in the common literature, but they're really the First Lady Astronaut Trainees. Along with Wally Funk, they are the two surviving members of that initial group, the First Lady Astronaut Trainees. She was always interested in flying. It came very natural to her. She was one of the women who actually had to quit her job in order to partake in the Lovelace tests. After the program ended, she worked as a flight instructor. She also was an advisor to the Federal Aviation Agency, and she's written a couple of books, including one that chronicles the Powder Puff Derbies, which were women-only transcontinental air races that many of the First Lady Astronaut Trainees either won or placed very highly in. There are two women from Michigan, and because I live in Michigan now, I really need to highlight them. Bea Stedman lived in Flint and then later on worked in Traverse City, where she founded Trimble Aviation. People from all over the state would drive up to take lessons from her, and she was considered one of the best flight instructors in the country. When she got the call from Lovelace to partake in the tests, she asked him to invite her friend Janie Hart. They were in the local chapter of the 99s together. Janie Hart was the wife of Senator Phil Hart, who was a longtime senator here in Michigan. She was also the first female helicopter pilot in the state of Michigan, probably getting that license so that she could ferry Senator Phil back and forth to his political appointments. Her husband Phil, and their 8 children enthusiastically supported her testing at the Lovelace Clinic. So she went there. She was a busy woman. She wasn't going to leave her children and her husband behind for a program where she might just be a guinea pig. She really thought that Lovelace was collecting data and working really hard to get women into space. After the program ended, she became an activist for women's rights and continued to be adventuresome. She sailed the Atlantic in a sailboat at the age of 72. So these women were pretty phenomenal. This slide kind of says it all. There were 75 different psychological and physical tests that the women underwent. The women were poked, probed, prodded. Doctors were trying to find out what these girls were made of, just like they did for the guys. One of the other First Lady Astronaut Trainees, Sarah Ratley, commented, I didn't mind the tests. You know, when you're young, you can take anything. I had made up my mind I was going to pass them. So they were all very, very determined women. This slide here shows just a few examples of some of those tests. In the upper left-hand panel, you can see Jerry Cobb undergoing electrical stimulation. The doctors were interested in how much stimulation she could tolerate and how quickly her body recovered from that stimulation. In the upper right-hand panel, you can see the sensory deprivation tank. This is Wally Funk hanging out in the sensory deprivation tank. Essentially, it's a tank filled with water that's matched to your body temperature. And you just lay in there and you can't feel anything around you because everything's the same temperature. The room was also dark and quiet. Most of the people who went into the sensory deprivation tank could last about 6 hours. Almost all of the women lasted more than 6 hours. Wally Funk lasted over 10 hours and only left when the staff members told her she could get out. So quite an endurance run there. In the lower left-hand panel is the physical endurance. So this is one of the women, the First Lady Astronaut Trainees, who's hooked up to a bicycle. And she's hooked up to different monitors that are measuring how quickly she's breathing, how quickly she's recovering, what her temperature is, how quickly she's pedaling, and also how her blood is flowing through her body. And just when they think they're done with it, an assistant will add some weights to the legs and they get to start all over again. Jan Dietrich, the woman who was 5'3" and 100 pounds, she lasted longest on this physical endurance bike and could carry the most weight on her legs. So these women were serious about the possibility of becoming astronauts. After all, they were in the clinic of a doctor who had done similar tests on the Mercury astronauts. So they were very dedicated to doing the best that they could. An important thing to note is all of the researchers indicated that the women complained significantly less than their male counterparts. So that's another reason that these women could have gone into space, would have been good space flyers. After the initial testing in phases 1 and 2 came phase 3, and this was a critical testing phase. This phase required access to the space simulation, the space simulator and other equipment at the Naval School of Aviation Medicine in Pensacola, Florida. This was a federal base run by the Navy. And when the officials called up NASA to get permission to let the women on the base in order to do these tests, NASA had no idea that this program was happening. Remember, this was a privately funded program in Albuquerque with a doctor working on his own to see whether or not women had the right stuff to fly in space. So unfortunately, the tests were canceled with just a few days' notice, and the women went home essentially empty-handed. So you can imagine how devastating this was. These women had put their personal lives, their professional lives on hold. They had quit their jobs. They had left their families behind for these tests. They had a dream of flying in space, and it was canceled because they couldn't participate in this phase 3 testing. So Janie Hart used some of her political connections to get a hearing before the subcommittee of the House Committee on Science and Astronautics in 1962. They implored the people to give them a chance. After all, they had just undertaken all of these tests that the Mercury 7 had undertaken, and in many cases done better than the Mercury 7. So why not give these women a chance to fly in space? Jerry Cobb stated, "We offer you 13 qualified volunteers." The next day, testimony included John Glenn, Jackie Cochran, and Scott Carpenter. John Glenn and Scott Carpenter had just come off of their own orbital flights around Earth. They were considered heroes. The room was packed with family members and sons and daughters waiting to meet these astronauts. John Glenn took the stand and he said, the fact of the matter is men fly the jets, they go to war, and then they come home. The fact that women are not in this field is just a fact of our social order. So this was a pretty devastating blow to Janie and to Jerry, followed up by Jackie Cochran's statement, testimony, which still is not quite understood by historians today, which was a testimony that was kind of counter to the support that she had given these First Lady Astronaut Trainees throughout the testing period. She thought that including women, she testified that including women in the space program could actually hurt NASA. I mean, what would happen if a woman died on the launch pad? Or what would happen if a woman died in space? What would happen if a woman got married or pregnant and actually had to leave the space program? What would that say about the NASA? And then that the day's testimony ended and there was no further conversation. Jerry Cobb and Janie Hart had no chance for a rebuttal. Word of this testimony, however, reached the White House, and one of the staffers was a little bit concerned about the message that this testimony was sending. So she drafted a letter that was to be sent to James Webb, who was the NASA administrator at the time, and it was to be signed by Lyndon Johnson. And in this letter, she writes on behalf of the president, "I'm sure you agree that sex should not be a reason for disqualifying a candidate for orbital flight. Could you please tell me if NASA has disqualified any women who wanted to be in the program? Or could you tell me if there are even any women in the United States who are qualified?" She presented this to the president to sign, but he never did. Years later, they found out that he'd written across the bottom of it, "Let's stop this now," and filed it, and it was never sent. These concerns about women astronauts, however, didn't seem to matter to the Soviets. Kamenin, who was the director of cosmonaut training at the time, had heard through the grapevine that the United States had a women in space program, that they were testing women to see if they could be good pilots. And at a backyard barbecue at John Glenn's house, weirdly enough, he found out more about that program. So he went back to the Soviet Union and talked with his colleagues about recruiting women to be female cosmonauts. And, because to have the first woman in space be an American would just be an insult to our women. So they recruited 5 women to be trained under as cosmonauts. And Valentina Tereshkova was selected to be the first woman in space. She was the daughter of blue-collar workers and farmers in the Soviet Union, and a skydiver. And the fact that she was a skydiver appealed to the Soviets because that means that she could land. She knew how to land. She spent 3 days in space, and she continues to be the only woman to have a solo space flight. Unfortunately, this did not indicate a trend in the Soviet space program because the next woman to fly was also Soviet, but that didn't happen until 1982. The aftermath of all of this testimony was important to document. It was the 1970s and times were changing. Inequities in our country were becoming more and more apparent, and the fact that all of NASA's astronauts were white males did not go unnoticed. In a letter from the Office of Federal Civil Rights Evaluation to NASA, it's asked that NASA start considering diversifying its astronaut corps so that it better represents the millions of people around the world who are watching the missions on TV, listening to them on the radio, and reading about them in the newspapers. At the same time that this is happening, the military is allowing women to enter their program and also participate in testing jet aircraft, which was the key to being an astronaut at the time, is you needed to have that jet aircraft experience. Women after World War II were not allowed to fly jet aircrafts, and that was one of the strikes against the First Lady Astronaut Trainees. Also at the same time, Nicolle Nichols was using her popularity as a popular TV character to promote space exploration and to promote diversity in the astronaut corps. While not an astronaut in its truest sense, she certainly played one on TV, and she used that influence to volunteer for NASA programs and to help recruit minority and women astronauts. And as a really interesting aside, she really did like science. She spent an 8-hour flight on the Kuiper Airborne Observatory, whose mission it was to study the atmospheres of Jupiter and Saturn. So that's kind of a nice little checkbox for her to be able to get that kind of real flight experience, if you will. Whatever the reason, the group of astronauts that was selected in the 1970s was the most diverse group of astronauts that NASA had ever selected. The 35 new guys included 6 women and 3 African-American males. NASA was embarking in a new era of space exploration where a space shuttle was going to launch into space fairly regularly. And the space shuttle needed a crew to staff it. It needed people to run experiments and people to fly the space shuttle. The people who ran the experiments are known as mission specialists. And these people were selected by NASA. They did not need to have jet aircraft experience. They didn't even have to be pilots, but they were selected to participate as mission specialists and do the experiments on the space shuttle and then eventually on the space station. Of the 6 women who were selected in that first class that included women was Sally Ride. Sally Ride grew up in California. She was a physics major and a physics PhD student at Stanford, and also a nationally ranked tennis player. She saw an ad in the local paper that NASA was recruiting astronauts, and she decided to apply. And she and her 5 female colleagues in that first class were highly regarded, including many of them broke records. The first spacewalk was by a member of their class. And of course, Sally became the first American woman in space in 1983. The Flats were pretty excited to see a woman in space, finally, an American woman in space in particular. And according to multiple sources, they were pleased about it, but she wasn't a pilot. She wasn't a pilot like they were. And because she wasn't a pilot, she wouldn't actually be flying that spacecraft. That didn't happen until 1995, when Eileen Collins became the first woman to actually pilot a space shuttle and then become a commander, a female commander of the space shuttle. 2 years later, Susan Kilrain was the next pilot, astronaut pilot of the space shuttle. Eileen Collins had heard about this group of women who had been tested under the same conditions with the same tests as the Mercury 7, but she didn't know if they were still alive and she didn't know how to find them. Word got out, she found them, she invited them to her launch where they were treated as VIPs. So here in these slides here, you can see their absolute joy at being able to see Eileen Collins fly into space, be the first female pilot to actually go into space and help realize the dreams that they had. A few years after that, NASA announced that it was going to conduct a geriatric study. They wanted to give John Glenn a chance to fly in space again, and they wanted to test the effects of spaceflight on an elderly population. So, for example, if we were going to start venturing out into space, we needed to know and understand how space affected people of all ages. Jerry Cobb, who was still optimistic that she would actually get to fly in space, took this as an opportunity to petition NASA for the chance to fly in space. After all, if you're going to do a geriatric study, you should have a male data point and a female data point. But her petition was denied. All these years later, the First Lady Astronaut Trainees are no longer forgotten. There have been several books written about them. There have been several biographies and autobiographies written as well. These are just a few that I've used for the research that I've done because I'm really interested in this topic. In 1996, all of them were inducted into the Women in Aviation International Pioneer Hall of Fame. And in 2007, they were given honorary doctorate degrees at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And so this is kind of special to me because I grew up in a small town near Oshkosh, and I would attend the EAA fly-in, the Experimental Aircraft Association fly-in. It's called AirVenture now, but it was a place that I would go and hear about aviation and meet astronauts and see all of these different planes. So the fact that Oshkosh gave them the honorary degrees is really appropriate. 50 years after Wally Funk, 60 years after Wally Funk was tested for her ability to fly in space to see if she had the right stuff, she actually got to do it. At the age of 82 in July, she became the oldest person to fly in space. She was asked by Jeff Bezos to join his crew on the Blue Origin suborbital flight. At the time of the flight, she had over 19,000 flight hours. So indeed, she had waited a really long time to finally get up there. I was glued to my TV on this. Maybe some of you were. That's a picture that I took of my TV screen. And Wally's got her arms out open as she's re-emerging from the spacecraft. She's not the most recent female pilot to go into space, however. That goes to Cyan Proctor. Cyan Proctor was the SpaceX Dragon Inspiration 4 pilot. She has been wanting to go to space for most of her life. She obtained her pilot's license in 6 months. She participated in multiple analog astronaut simulations on the moon and Mars missions, simulated moon and Mars missions. And now that she has actually realized her dream, she can start to talk to people about the perseverance and persistence and just doing the things that you need to do to achieve your goals and figure out and realize your dreams. So I hope she gets to fly again. And she certainly has been an inspiration. The next female pilot who will probably pilot a spacecraft or command a spacecraft is Sunita Williams. Sunita is a longtime NASA astronaut veteran. She's a naval test pilot. She has logged hours in more than 30 different kinds of spacecraft and aircraft. She's currently assigned to command Boeing Starliner's first post-certification mission. It's kind of a mouthful to say all of that, and which will launch sometime in the near future. So that's very exciting that women pilots will continue the legacy of the flats and fly in space. This whole Women in Space program, Lovelace tests, the space race, none of that probably would have happened if we hadn't had a desire to go to the moon. I'm a lunar scientist, so it doesn't seem right that I give a talk and not talk about the moon. So we're going to take a slight departure to the moon, and you'll see how this all ties in a little bit. Especially now, as we celebrate the 50th anniversaries of the Apollo missions to the moon between 1969 and 1972. The work and the things that we learned, the work that was done and the things that we learned from the Mercury 7 helped land Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong safely on the moon and get Gene Cernan and Jack Schmitt off the moon at Apollo 17. So it just seems right that we talk about what the moon has told us about our solar system. The 800 pounds of lunar samples that have been curated here on Earth are revealing all sorts of information about the moon's evolution, about its origin, about its interior, about its episodes of active volcanism, and about its water. There's actually water on the moon. It's very spread out, but it's there. The samples that I study are called lunar impact glasses. These little tiny microscopic pieces of glass help us understand bombardment from comets and asteroids and meteorites throughout the inner solar system over time. So the moon's samples have allowed us to learn a lot about the moon, but there are still a lot of questions. The moon rocks that have been distributed to all of the states and all of the countries in the world were given out to the leaders at the time as a gesture of goodwill, that the United States had gone to the moon and collected samples for peace, for all humankind. For all of you listening out there, I encourage you to find out where your state's moon rocks are or where your country's moon rocks are and go take a look at them if they can. The ones in Michigan are on display at the Michigan History Center in Lansing. The one in Wisconsin is in storage at the State Capitol building. You can go to collectspace.com and you can find out where your moon rock is or if it's missing, right? And if you know where it is, tell somebody. We are going back to the moon. There's an imminent return. The Apollo legacy, collecting those rocks, landing those men on the moon, did not end with Apollo 17. Exploration is continuing, and NASA and the commercial space industry are ramping up their exploration. There are commercial landers that are being competed that contain scientific instruments that will investigate the lunar surface, the lunar exosphere, all sorts of things are being investigated. We are planning at some point to put a space station of sorts around the moon. This is called Gateway, which will one day be crewed. And all of that is in preparation for landing the next man and the first woman on the moon in the Artemis program. Earlier this year, or in the last couple of months, it's hard to know time anymore, as we all know in the pandemic. These 9 women were announced as part of the 18 people who might be part of the Artemis crew. They are geologists, they're doctors, they're engineers, they're mothers, they're sisters and wives and aunts and cousins. And it's really exciting to think that one of these women, or maybe somebody who's not even on this list, will be the first woman to step foot on the moon. So as you may have noticed from some of the dates that I've included for these women on the slides, there aren't a lot of flats left. There are 2 surviving from the original group, Wally Funk and Janora Jessen. And while we have scientists and engineers who are working hard to get us back to the moon, every day we are losing the people who helped us get there in the first place. The hidden figures, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Christine Darden. These women have been honored with congressional gold medals, and they've had they've had buildings named after them. I argue that it's time that the Mercury 13, the First Lady Astronaut Trainees, be honored with congressional gold medals as well. The data points that they provided at the Lovelace Clinic helped inform the medical profession and NASA that women were just as capable of flying in space and withstanding the pressures and the stresses of space as men were. I wrote a post about this in 2018 on my website where I'm collecting names so I can petition our representatives to start the process to get a congressional gold medal for these women. If you're interested, I urge you to go to my website, click on the December 2018 post, read through it, and then click on the petition, and then start lobbying your own state representatives to contact Debbie Stabenow's office out of Michigan and have them start really collecting the names and getting the word out there that the First Lady Astronaut Trainees deserve a congressional gold medal as well. And with that, I thank you. I owe a lot of this story to Martha Ackman. So if you're watching, thank you. She and Wally Funk came to campus here at Albion in 2010 to a packed auditorium of kids and people of all ages to hear about their exciting, Martha's exciting story and Wally's exciting life. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Nicole. That was a really great talk and very informative. So anyone out there who's listening on YouTube, please put your comments or questions into the live chat, and we will do our best to answer all of them. So the first question we have, Nicole, is when you met with Carl Sagan shortly before he died, did he share anything especially memorable with you?
The fact that I remember what he said, sure. I was at my second professional society meeting. It was actually a DPS meeting in Boulder, Colorado. And I I think I knew that he was going to be there. So I brought my book, my Cosmos book, and I handed it to him to sign. And I said, oh, you know, of course, you meet a celebrity, right? I'm so glad to meet you. You're one of the reasons I stayed in science. And the other people around me were like, me too, me too, me too, me too, me too. And he kind of looked at all of us and he says, oh, I feel so responsible for all of you. So I guess that is memorable.
Great, thanks. While we're waiting for more questions to come in on YouTube, are there any questions in your live audience there?
Yes.
Yeah, Nicolle, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but when UW-Oshkosh gave the honorary doctorates to the surviving members, did they also award them posthumously to the ones who are no longer around?
So the question is, when the women received the honorary doctorates at UW-Oshkosh, did they also award them posthumously to the ones who had passed on? I don't know the answer to that. I would like to think yes.
Great. Any other questions in the room there?
Yes.
I'm just curious, of all the different tests that were performed on these women, why the electrical stimulation? Is there a physiological experience that someone gets when they're in outer space? That's really it just seemed like an odd test to me.
So the question was, why were the women subjected to electrical stimulation while they were at the Lovelace clinic? Is that some indication of something that might happen in space? I don't know the answer to that. At that point, nobody had flown in space except for animals. And so they really didn't know what might happen. I think the doctors were really poking, prodding, and probing just to get any data at all to investigate anything that might happen.
Any other questions in the room?
Not so far. Yeah?
One more.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't remember her name. I want to say Ruth Nichols, I could be wrong. Woman who was tested in 1959 and then died in 1960. Was there any real causal relationship there, or was it just coincidental?
Oh no, that was just coincidental. Right. Oh, the question was, Ruth Nichols was tested in 1959 and then died in 1960. And was there a causal relation to that? And I'm pretty sure the answer is no.
Okay, well, we have another question from online. What would you be excited for us to discover on the south polar region of the moon?
Oh, okay. So that's a lunar science question. One of the motivations for returning to the moon is to investigate the bombardment history of the moon. South Pole Aiken, the south polar region of the moon, is the largest impact basin on the moon and is presumed to be the oldest. So people are interested in collecting a piece of South Pole Aiken that was actually formed when South Pole Aiken was formed, so that we can get the age, the timing of when that basin formed. So that would be a very exciting sample to collect from South Pole Aiken. One that's, you know, old and gives us the age of South Pole Aiken.
Great. So I had a question that was, oh, here's another one. I'll ask the online one.
Thank you.
From Jenny Larson. We have seen a lot of progress for women over the years, as you have shown, but how have trans people influenced spaceflight?
That's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. I hope that with commercial spaceflight and with agency, federal spaceflight, whatever it is, JAXA, ESA, the Japanese Space Agency, the European Space Agency, the NASA, I hope that spaceflight is open for everybody, regardless of identity.
So a related follow-on question, what steps do you think are needed now to create a more equitable community for future space scientists?
Certainly there needs to be more training in diversity and inclusion issues. NASA and the Science Mission Directorate have core values that include inclusion, leadership, safety, excellence, and by permeating those core values throughout NASA as an agency and down through all of the staff who work at NASA and then out into the community and making it a part of our everyday actions and not just a workshop that we attend once or twice a year, if that, by making a part of our daily activity. I'm hoping that our community can become much more diverse and inclusive.
Related to that question from Vanessa McCaffrey, are any of the astronauts, current or trainees, LGBTQIA+?
That's another good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks. Yeah, so are there any other questions in the room right now?
Yes.
So
Great.
John Glenn went back to space, but then you said that at that point there was no more geriatric astronauts. Was there a reason? Is there ill effects, or why is that the case?
So the question is, John Glenn went back into space as part of a geriatric study, but then afterwards there was no follow-up. And what's the reason for that? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure people can venture a guess about why it wasn't done. John Glenn was a very popular person. He was a very popular astronaut. He was the first American to orbit the Earth. And he never flew again after that, partially as a way to make sure he didn't die in a space accident because he was such a hero. I like to think NASA gave him that opportunity to fly as an elderly person, just so that he could fly again. Yes.
The Artemis project that you mentioned, that is almost certainly, or is it certainly, a male and a female landing on the moon and setting their feet on the ground of the moon. It's just, they haven't particularly said that it's this person or this person. It's like when it happens, we're going to be sure to put a woman in the crew, and they will be one of the people that's put their feet on the moon. Is that how it's decided?
So the question is, how definite is it that NASA will actually land a woman on the moon during the Artemis mission? I think it's pretty definite. If you search anything on Artemis and NASA, that phrasing is throughout the press and throughout the pages. The next man and the first woman will land on the moon during the first Artemis mission. Yes.
So when are you going to go up into space?
The question is, when am I going up into space? I prefer to explore space from my laboratory.
We have a question from online from George Carlisle. Did John Glenn ever revise his opinion about women and their place in the, quote, social order?
He was a fan of the First Lady Astronaut Trainees that I've read. And so I like to think that he did. After all, he had a wife, right, Annie? But I don't know that for sure. I don't know that he changed it. I would like to think that he did. Yeah.
Sure. Especially as a eventual influential senator, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm gonna take the prerogative to ask you a question. What is the most exciting thing that you're looking forward to in human space flight in the next 10 years, let's say?
Yeah, so I used Wikipedia to look at the women astronauts. And what I noticed is that there is starting to be more and more women added to this list who are not NASA astronauts. There are women on the list like Wally Funk, who flew on Blue Origin, and Cyan Proctor, who flew on SpaceX. And there's a couple of test engineers who flew on some of the other spacecraft that actually passed beyond the von Karman line, which is what signifies spaceflight. So I'm really excited about commercial space exploration, and I hope that the seats are doled out favorably and equitably to all. And I do kind of like this idea that NASA's not your only ticket into space anymore, that there are these other agencies out there, these other companies out there who are doing this. It has to be done safely, of course. It has to be done ethically, of course. But these multiple new opportunities are really exciting, I think, for opening up space to a larger population of people.
So follow on from the Slack, how equitable are spaceflight programs in the commercial sector and in other countries as well?
Well, I think it's such a young industry right now. It's really hard to gauge that. It's really hard. I don't know the demographics of the recent space flights from over the summer, right? I do know that there were women on the flight. I do know that there were people of all ages on the flights, and I know that there were people of multiple races and ethnicities on the flights. That's all that I know from what I saw with my eyes, right? I don't know for sure how they identify, but visibly that's who flew. So I think we just have to wait and see. We need some more data points. But again, I'll say it again. I hope that these seats are distributed in an ethical way and in an equitable way.
Thank you. So another question from our live stream on YouTube from Allie Chen. How are SpaceX and Blue Origin astronauts being trained differently or similarly to NASA astronauts?
I wish I knew, but I'm not training for any of those space flights. One thing that did surprise me is between the timing of the announcement of the crew and the time of the flight was very short, right? And we have astronauts in the NASA astronaut corps that train for years. They train for years for a shuttle flight, especially if they have to launch a satellite or if they have to do a repair, for example, when we could repair the Hubble Space Telescope. If they're flying to the space station and they have to do experiments up there, they train for quite a long period of time to get up to speed. So right now, these SpaceX and Blue Origin astronauts, and I don't want to diminish this at all, so please don't take it that way. They're going up for a ride and they're coming back. I don't know that they're yet conducting experiments to the degree that NASA reports that the NASA astronauts conduct experiments. So I'm thinking that their training it's much shorter. But again, I am not training for either NASA or a commercial space industry, so I don't know for sure.
Thanks. Another question from YouTube. If we want humans to populate space, we need women in space. Someday this won't even be an issue. Do you think space tourism will become commonplace in the next decade or so?
It depends on how expensive it is. Seats, I think, are going for $200,000 to $400,000, if not more, American dollars. Not a lot of us have that sitting in our bank account. Well, maybe a lot do. I don't know. I don't. So I think it all depends on the cost, on how quickly space tourism is going to take off. Maybe not in the next decade. Maybe in a couple of decades or multiple decades.
Thanks. So for anybody who's on the live stream, I'll just say, we have about a little more than 5 minutes left. So please post your questions if you want to ask Nicolle anything. We do have one more in the Slack. Do you think little girls today are seeing that being an astronaut is an option? And how are we encouraging them to do this?
I think I think they do see being an astronaut as an option. The NASA astronaut office regularly takes in requests for astronauts to visit schools, to talk to people about what it's like to be an astronaut. And certainly plenty of those women astronauts are doing that same thing. How do you encourage girls to stay in science? I think you don't tell them no. Don't tell them not to do things because they're going to get dirty or they might break something or they might fall. Let them do that. Let them make mistakes. My parents let me make mistakes all the time. And encourage them. Take them to events where there are women scientists speaking. Take them to events where there are women engineers who are talking or presenting things. Let them do science projects. If they have the interest, then they have the aptitude, and you just have to continue to encourage them to pursue those interests and to practice the things that make them happy and make them joyful. And if it's science, all the better.
Yes, I totally agree. Getting dirty is half the fun. That's why I like working with them. Do you have any questions in the room?
Yes, there's one.
Okay.
Back to the Mercury 13 in phase 3. Did they make it to Pensacola? And were they only there 2 days and they only got through some of the tests? Is that
So the question is what actually happened in Pensacola during phase 3 testing. As far as I've been able to understand and read from the books and understand from the books I've read, is only Jerry Cobb actually completed the tests in Pensacola. And I don't even really know the details of how and why she was allowed to do that, but the other women were not. So she was the only one to actually complete all 3 tests. And then when the rest of the women were going to come, that's when the trip was canceled.
Great. Well, we're coming close to the end of our time. Nicolle, do you have any last remarks or thoughts that you want to share?
I thank the DPS selection committee for honoring me with the Carl Sagan Medal. I have really enjoyed researching the First Lady Astronaut Trainees. I don't have all the answers about spaceflight or astronauts or commercial industry or anything like that. This is just an interest of mine. I encourage all of you who ask the questions that I didn't have the answers to do your own investigation, see what kind of answers you can come up. Be curious. Everybody should just be curious and, keep thinking about space exploration in a way that will help lots of people achieve the dreams if going into space is something they want to do. Thanks again to everybody who came and is listening to this talk.
Thank you so much, Nicolle. Okay, well, everyone have a great evening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay, we're all clear.
Wow.
Nice job.
Thank you. I guess I didn't know that I was going to be answering